Interested in more cinema of meaning? Each month we have an entire bonus episode available exclusively on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. So far we've talked about Sam Mendes' 1917, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, and Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, 2001: A Space Odyssey. In addition to those and any future bonus exclusive episodes, you'll also get access to our regular episodes ad-free and a week early when you listen on Nebula. The best way to get Nebula is with the Curiosity Stream bundle. You can learn more about that in the description below or go to curiositystream.com/cinema of meaning. You can even plug the Nebula feed into a normal podcast player and listen wherever you like. Sign up today to get more cinema of meaning and access to all the other great content on Nebula. Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast from myself, Thomas Flight, and fellow video essayist Tom van der Linden from the channel Like Stories of Old that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. This week, we're talking about the Martin McDonagh film from 2008, In Bruges. Tom, why were you interested in talking about In Bruges?
Well, actually, it's one of my girlfriend's favorite movies, so she's been dying to have us do an episode about a movie that she's actually seen. She's quite busy. She doesn't watch as many movies as we do. So for me, it's one of my favorites as well. I think I've seen it like 5-6 times now. I actually didn't even plan on rewatching it for this episode, but I did it anyways. I saw it again today, and it's funny because in my memory, it's always quite a tragic and sad film, but every time then I put it on, like I get like drawn into that place all over again, and I just you almost forget like how funny it is also. And yeah, I think it's a fascinating movie about guilt and what ways there are for like atonement, redemption. And so yeah, I actually got to visit Bruges last December. So
I was going to ask you that, if you've been to Bruges.
Yeah, actually, it was supposed to be a birthday present for me. My birthday is in April, but then COVID happened, so it didn't happen. But then last December, like we were kind of passing by. We were visiting my girlfriend's grandparents in Paris, and so it's kind of sort of on the way. And it was like getting more possible with in terms of COVID. Like we had been boosted or vaccinated and boosted, and the numbers were a little bit better. So we decided like, okay, let's just do it now. And it was actually quite nice because it still was like quiet because the tourism hadn't yet picked up as it probably would have been during normal times. So we actually went, there's the clock tower that's in the movie as well. We visited, and there's like this sign that says, okay, pay attention, like from here on out, it's like a 45-minute wait. And so we kind of picked like besides the sign, and there's no one there. So we walked like through the gate, in which in the movie, that's actually where you have to pay. But in reality, you can like walk a little bit further, and then you're in like the inner courtyard, and then like still there was no one there, and we walked up, and then we went straight to like the cashier, and then we just walked up, and there was pretty much no one there, like maybe 3 or 4 people. We came pretty close to like the In Bruges movie experience in terms of quietness. It did look a little bit different up there. It's obviously it's like all not wires, but like a grading thing. Anyway, you cannot get out of there or like jump off, as does happen in the movie. Spoiler alert, like right away, I guess. But
is the swan still there?
The swan. There are swans in Bruges, yeah.
Did you go on the canals and stuff?
Yeah, we did that too. I figured I wanted to have the same experience, so. And it was also quite cloudy, so I think that it's one of the few towns or cities where bad weather actually enhances the fairy tale-ness of it all.
The experience, yeah. So was this the first time you've watched it since you went?
Yeah.
Did being in Bruges change the experience of the movie at all, do you think?
I think it's the same with like, you obviously notice like when you're actually in Bruges, like you can see the spots that they filmed were obviously the most fairy tale-ish spots. And there's like shopping centers too, and there's like whole streets with like more modern buildings or like just regular, like not so aesthetically pleasing cityscapes. So it's, you see through the facade a little bit. At least I see through the facade now like a little bit, because I know like, okay, it's not all of Bruges that looks like
There is that double carriageway or whatever right after you come off the train. That
Exactly. And then there's a whole lot more of those kinds of things that, that break the illusion a little bit. But no, overall, it's a lovely town to visit. And I'd highly recommend anyone, if you have the chance to do so, to go give it a visit.
Unless maybe you're fleeing your own like deep-seated guilt or something, then you'll just think it's terrible.
And then you just go to the Bahamas.
In Bruges, by the way, for anybody, like in case you haven't seen it, or just as a refresher if it's been a while, is a movie about like two hitmen who are kind of on the run and they end up in Bruges. And as the movie unfolds, you kind of learn more about why they're there, like what they're running from, and this whole like scenario unfolds. But it's also like a dark comedy. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as you already alluded to, it's kind of about guilt and dealing with kind of these ethical, moral dilemmas or whatever, and purgatory and these different things. It utilizes the place very effectively, I think. And kind of like the conceit is largely that the main character, played by Colin Farrell, hates Bruges and just despises it, despite the fact that it's this beautiful, like, fairy tale place. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's a fun movie. This was the third time I've seen it. Even though I had seen it twice before already, there's always, like, the way the plot unfolds is so fun. Like, it peels back all these little layers of, like, you know, revelation about the characters or the situation. And it's very satisfying. Like, every time I've watched it, it's a little bit surprising, and there's things that like catch me off guard, even though I had already seen it. And like, it's fairly well written in that there's all these little details that you think like might be a one-off joke, but then it ends up coming back later and like playing a significant role in the story. Like, they don't leave any thread
unconnected, or
you know, the way it's structured. I think it's a movie that like, it is funny, but then it's kind of deceptively deep and poignant as well. Mm-hmm. So what's our angle of attack here? How do you think we should start unpacking what is In Bruges?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Maybe the setting, because as you said, like the place itself plays such an important role.
Yeah.
It's almost like the city is another character.
Yeah. People always say that about movies or whatever.
Any movie that has a strong setting.
Yes, in this scenario, it is truly the case. It's right in the title, too.
Yeah. I guess it's just also slight spoiler territory that the whole setting is basically also this, it comes down to this joke because as we later learn, like the whole trip to Bruges was sort of a gift towards Ray, Colin Farrell's character. Like Ray Fiennes, his character is like the hitman boss, evil type dude. And he wanted to give like Ray this parting gift. Like he wanted him to see like the beauty of In Bruges, or the beauty of Bruges. Yeah. And so of course I think the joke is that of course he absolutely hates it.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's the obvious like symbolism there between, it's kind of framed as the fairy tale city. The film explicitly says like maybe it's purgatory, like it's a kind of like heightened realism to it. That's you get a sense of that in every shot and every location that they're at. Like it's a bit otherworldly, I guess, enhances that kind of symbolism. That's the kind of on the nose stuff, probably, in the sense that it's explicitly said in the movie that maybe this is purgatory. Yeah.
That kind of comes more towards the end, although there's allusions to it. Like they kind of make this connection at one point early on. They go and look at some Hieronymus Bosch art in a museum, which kind of depicts like hell or purgatory in a medieval setting. And so there's kind of this connection between the medieval environment that they're in and these ideas of like purgatory and suffering. And then the film set that the movie kind of ends on, where he meets the dwarf and the woman that he goes on a couple dates. Ray meets the woman he goes on a couple dates with. That film set is, somebody describes it as at one point as like a Boschian nightmare. So there's like Hieronymus Bosch and purgatory are kind of interwoven as themes into this, which is kind of in contrast, but also complementary to the medieval beauty and romanticism of the place.
Yeah, I was going to say that the city, you have the obvious symbolism, but there's also, with the explicit history that's in that city, the old paintings, the churches, and the kind of existential questions of morality that they naturally invoke, it also becomes like this plot element almost of this driving or this triggering aspect for both of these characters to kind of explore those themes and to have those revelations about the guilt that they carry and the kind of roads for atonement or redemption that they can envision. So it does also, like, it's not just like set dressing, it connects to the development of the characters and the way they communicate to each other, and to some extent like the way the plot drives forward. Because as you said, like it's literally a plot element, because Harry wants to basically get rid of Ray.
Yeah.
Because as we learn, did we mention that Ray, he on his first hit job, he was supposed to kill a priest and he succeeded, but he also, like, he hit with the same bullet, it went through the priest and hit like this young child. Like he accidentally killed a child on his first job. And so that's obviously, even in the world of Hitman, that's a big no-no. Because of that,
Right.
Harry, he's like this, I said he was like the evil character, but he's also like a very principled character. Like he does have a code of honor, which we can probably touch on at some point. And so he wants Ray dead. And so that's why he gave this parting gift as the beauty of Bruges as his last memory or last experience or something like that.
And that's what drives the funniest parts of the movie to me too, is just this whole dynamic of these hitmen, the culture that they seem to have, which is very like kind of polite. They get very angry at each other. You know, they curse up a storm and all these things, but they also are kind of like oddly just like polite and deferent. And they have this weird like code of ethics. And, you know, it comes into play more towards the end, especially between like Harry and Ken, you know, where like Ken gives this whole speech and then Harry isn't able to shoot him. And obviously one of the key pivotal moments of the film, which is like we find out Ken is the one, they've come to Bruges, and then Harry calls Ken and Ken's supposed to go kill Ray, and he goes to kill him. He finds him at this park and he goes to kill him, but turns out Ray is about to kill himself. And so like Ken stops him from killing himself. There's just this dynamic between all the hitmen where
it's just such a funny visual too. That, like,
right, yes.
Ken, who is about to shoot Ray, who is about to shoot himself, and somehow it ends up with nobody getting shot. But
and then they sit there afterwards and talk about the fact that like Ken was about to kill him, and he was, you know, they deal with everything in all these very like matter-of-fact terms. So yeah, I just love this whole world. There's a world that's constructed beyond just the world of like Bruges and the setting. There's another like a weird culture of hitmen that, you know, I've never met a hitman. I'm assuming it's not actually like this. There's this bizarre culture of hitmen that has been constructed for this film that is in and of itself pretty funny and amusing.
Yeah, I think it's just also one of those movies that sits on that perfect intersection between having enough budget to do like something worthwhile, but also like not enough to be bounded by like necessity of restraint and to not go overboard or add too much bloatedness, and probably maybe have some studio control, like enough that the director doesn't go like too far in some place. Like it feels like this extremely tight movie where it sets up so many little details and they all like connect, as you said. And I wonder, were there any specific details that you picked up on this time around?
Something that I was thinking about, I guess because I had seen it multiple times, it was more immediate to me. There's the reveal at the end, like the whole moral crux of the story is like Ray has accidentally killed this child, and the hitmen draw a line in the sand where they're like, you can kill somebody you're paid to kill, you can kill an adult, but like a child, that's across the line. You know, we've crossed some kind of moral line there. And then a lot of the movie is spent like dealing with where exactly that line falls. And the kind of ironic, jokey reveal at the end is that Harry, in trying to kill Ray, accidentally kills Jimmy, the dwarf, who's dressed up as a child, and then ends up killing himself because he thinks that he's killed a child, which is, Harry has drawn this hard line in the sand. I won't kill a child. He says to Ken earlier, like, if it had been me, I would have stuck the gun in my mouth and killed myself. And that's kind of the standard that he's holding Ray to. And then, you know, we end up with this funny situation at the end. But that whole theme of like childhood is very pervasive throughout the whole film. And that's something that I feel like I was more aware of this time than the previous two times I'd watched it. Jimmy as a dwarf is present throughout the film. And like, to some extent, Ray has a very like offensive not politically correct view of Jimmy as a dwarf and kind of finds him funny, and that's like part of the film. But like thematically, him being like the size of a child ends up playing a role in the film and is kind of there as maybe like a reminder to Ray. Part of the reason I think Ray is maybe so fascinated by Jimmy is because he has this trauma associated with accidentally killing this child. And then there's that theme of childhood just then crops up in a lot of different places. Like things take place on a playground. The movie that they make an allusion to, that the film set is filming, a child plays a significant role in that. I forget it's a Nicholas Roeg film. I forget the name of it. I've seen it a while ago.
I don't remember that either. You have the hotel owners
is pregnant. Yes. I think Don't Look Now is the film. Yeah. By Nicholas Roeg. There's like a child there's scenes of children in that movie that play a significant role. Harry, the time that he was in Bruges, the last time he was in Bruges, when he saw it as this fairy tale land, and the whole reason he wanted to send Ray, he was there when he was like 7 or 8, I think, which is around the age or a little bit older than the child that Ray accidentally kills. I don't know, there might be some that I'm missing, but the whole film is kind of just like saturated in this like the presence of children or childhood.
Yeah. And he goes to a playground also when he intends to kill himself.
Yes. And this is where we can get into this, maybe the moral dilemma of the film. Ken starts referring to, when he's around Harry especially, starts referring to Ray as a boy or the boy. And it's almost setting up this same like, okay, it's wrong to kill a child, but then where do you draw that line? And why is it wrong to kill a child? Like there's an innocence there to childhood that it's wrong to put an end to. But what if Ray is a child is kind of, I think, the question that like Ken is dealing with.
Yeah. Probably not like in the literal sense, but in the sense,
right,
I mean, like
yes.
He still has a certain like innocence or at least potential for change. Like he has a future ahead of him in which he can do good, in which he can still like mean something or overcome whatever he had done in the past.
That tension between like Harry wanting to hold Ray to this moral standard and then Ken wanting to give him this second chance kind of becomes the pivotal conflict there. How do you feel watching this movie? I'm curious. Like, it's a very strange film in that like you're presented with this character who, Ray, is a horrible person and he's killed a child. You're not given any like objective reason to really like sympathize with him. But like the feeling I have throughout the movie is like, I don't really want him to have to die. I'm curious how you feel and what you think about the way this movie is maybe like playing with our sympathies for these terrible people.
You're supposed to feel some sympathy for Colin Farrell's character. I think he just, as an actor, he does so much of the work because he is so good in this movie. Like I think it's one of the funniest parts he's ever played. And for me, it's like one of my favorite like comedic performances of all time. Now that I think of it, you also have like, when you mention like Ray being this kind of childlike character, you also see it in the way he sort of sulks around behind Ken. There's this scene in the church where Ken is kind of in this adult reverence for like the church as this sacred space where you're supposed to be quiet, and then Ray's sitting there like playing around with the chair, and then he gets like criticized by Ken, and then he steps up and he drags his feet across the floor and he's still making noise, and he's he's just kind of being this annoying little brat about having to do like adult stuff. And in those moments he really does feel like this little boy who just wants to go and play instead of tag along with mommy and daddy to see all the boring old history. This episode was brought to you by Mubi, the curated streaming service showing hand-picked exceptional films from around the globe, which both Thomas and I have been big fans of for many years. They have a fantastic library of amazing films, and they add a new one every day. Whether it's a timeless classic, a cult favorite, or an acclaimed masterpiece, there's always something new to discover.
And if you want to listen to more in-depth discussions about cinema, Mubi's acclaimed audio documentary series, The Mubi Podcast, returns this summer for its second season. This time it's going to focus on movie theaters themselves. It's titled Only in Theaters, and the new season will tell surprising stories of individual movie theaters that had a huge impact on film history and in some cases, history in general. You can listen to the latest season of the Mubi Podcast absolutely free wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you want to try Mubi itself, you can do so for free for 30 days by going to mubi.com/cinema of meaning. That's Mubi, mubi.com/cinema of meaning for 30 days of great cinema for free.
Click the link in the description or go to mubi.com/cinema of meaning for your extended 30-day free trial.
I do think you're supposed to see within Ray also like the potential for both for evil and for good, I think, like, or at the very least, like the struggle with conscience, or at least for me, like I didn't feel like I wanted Ray to have an happy ending, or like I didn't necessarily want him to escape or like be absolved from his sins. And I really like the direction the ending took, like that he mentions, like if he survives, like I'm gonna go to this boy's family, I'm gonna like offer myself up to them, and I'm gonna accept whatever punishment they have for me. I think that's for him like the best possible outcome at this point, because he plays it so well in the way you really get to viscerally experience his struggle with guilt. You know that if he were to like escape to some faraway place, he's not going to be happy. If he was going to do something else or anything else, basically, like he would not be able to let this go. So you want something else from him, I think, naturally, other than just the typical standard happy ending. And I think that's one of the most fascinating parts of this movie, is that I don't know many other stories that really communicate the weight of guilt in this way. It kind of reminded me of the Dostoevsky novel, Crime and Punishment, in which there's a different character and premise, but it also comes down to this guy who kills someone and then is kind of overwhelmed by the guilt he didn't expect to have. Like he becomes like physically ill, like he gets like a fever, he's like bedstricken, and it feels weird like reading that, like if you're like, fortunately I'm not carrying that kind of guilt, so I wouldn't know what that's like, but yet I almost can't imagine like the way that would like physically encapsulate like your whole body, instead of just being something that you like. I have minor regrets, but like I can like sort of push them away or like get over them or like let them go. Like I haven't yet experienced like the sense of guilt from something that's also like something that's completely irreversible. Like that's one of the major aspects of Ray's guilt. Like he's done something, like, and he brings it up again and again. Like there's no undoing what he has done. Like he says, like I think towards the end, he says there's like this Christmas tree somewhere in England with a bunch of presents that will never be opened. And I think somewhere else he said like this boy is dead. Like he's never going to be alive again. Like he's never going to see Bruges. Or there's a weight to the kind of guilt when you have done something that's irreversible and that you obviously feel bad about, that I find really interesting. When I think about like minor regrets, I've had like moments where, for example, I remember like it's like a couple of years ago, I was driving my car and I cut someone off, like another car. Like it wasn't like this major thing. I thought I had right of way, but I didn't in hindsight. It wasn't this big thing because there was a car coming from the other side and he was kind of very slowly like driving or like turning onto the road that I was on. And I kind of like swiveled around him, like fortunately not dangerously, but definitely like a bit jerkishly. I truly felt like bad about that the whole day after. Like I was like completely off of my like my whole mind. I couldn't let it go. Like I kept replaying it in my mind, because the worst thing about it was the car was this like education car. Like there was a student driving in it. Like, who are like marked with. Right. But I didn't know if there was like a student in it or it was just the owner of because in I'm not sure how it is in the United States, but we have a lot of like cars are just like self-employed. Yeah, so they kind of drive around privately as well as for when they're educating someone. So of course in hindsight, like I figured like maybe I should have stopped or like made some sort of signal towards the other car that they would know that I was wrong and I like acknowledge it. Right. But I didn't do that. Like it's funny how in a moment like that you kind of like panic. And so I guess I can understand, like I wouldn't justify like people driving away after like a more serious altercation or like even an accident, but I understand like the impulse that people might have. I don't know how it's in the United States, but we have this law that you can still, if you're in an accident, like in a car accident, and you report it within 24 hours, you're still like good. Like they kind of like acknowledge the psychology. Like sometimes people will just do weird things in like a
panicked state or
panicked state. And so they have that within the law, there's this little bit of breathing room for like people to get to the senses and then come back and face whatever it is they have to face. But So yeah, but that was just like the tiniest example, but
Right.
like, and even that, like, it weighed on my conscience like for quite a bit. Like I felt like I should have acted differently, like I should have done something else, which I didn't. And so I can only imagine like what that would be like if I did like something I would truly regret, like something
Right.
big and irreversible. And I think we tend to underestimate, if you are not like familiar with having that kind of guilt, like what the true weight of that is and what it just would cost you, like mentally and physically. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that In Bruges just perfectly communicates almost.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the point it's making at the end of the movie about being purgatory, is like being in Bruges by Ray's standard, because he says like, maybe that's hell, being in Bruges for eternity or something like that. It's like being in Bruges isn't really being in Bruges. It's for him, like, I think the movie is kind of presenting this concept of like being in a place that by all regards should be this like kind of pleasant fairy tale, but yet all you can think about is the horrible thing you've done or how terrible it is, or like you are stuck in this horrible place, like mentally. And so it's like, no matter where you go, you could go to the nicest, most idyllic spot in wherever, and you'd still feel this way. And that's the kind of the purgatorial, like stuck in guilt or stuck in whatever that this movie is dealing with. And the movie is kind of like showing that arc of like Ray realizing that and kind of coming to terms with that moment where he says something about like wanting to go to the Bahamas instead. But I feel like you could have also made this movie in the Bahamas and like made like kind of the same movie, because like in the Bahamas, Ray would have found a way to be just as miserable as he is in Bruges, probably.
Yeah. The movie offers like different roads for atonement. Yeah, you have Harry's character who's very like principled about, okay, if you cross this line, like it's game over, like it's best to just either kill yourself or let yourself be killed by someone else. Whereas Ken, he is more like about like, okay, you killed this boy, now try to save the next one.
Yeah.
To which Ray responds like, what am I going to be, like a doctor? You need exams. But anyways, like he believes like the road of atonement is to try and do like, it's more like a karma kind of thing where you've done bad and now you have to outweigh it with like good intentions.
Good.
But I think in the end, Ray finds his own sort of solution. As we said, like it's a sort of in-between version, like he's not killing himself or he's not dying, or at least not, it wasn't his intention or not his hope. Like he wants to live on, but he wants to like receive punishment, essentially.
That's the version that most people, I think, in society would want from somebody who has committed some kind of wrong. Maybe not for a hitman, but imagine a scenario where you just accidentally commit manslaughter or some kind of horrific atrocity, like in an unintentional way, or even if it was intentional. But like specifically with this movie, where the key issue is dealing with like a kind of an accident. And it's like, I think most people in society would say like, yeah, like the right thing to do in that situation is to just accept whatever punishment the legal system or society like has for you. It sucks because like obviously you didn't intend for that thing to happen, but then like bear the weight of that punishment. And that's kind of the path that Ray ultimately goes down.
He doesn't exactly offer him up to like the lawful punishment. He specifically mentions going to the family and whatever they want. So maybe if they want prison for him, that's fine.
Yeah.
If they want to lock him up in a basement somewhere and torture him, that's fine too then, I guess. Like he's not going to like enjoy it either way, but he wants to lose the burden of that weight, I guess. Any way he can.
Yeah, the key is that he's giving it up. He's not like trying to, which I think is the dichotomy on either side of him. You have Harry and Ken, who is like, Ken is like, okay, we save you. And Harry's like, we must punish you. But both of them are still leaving it within their own hands, their own system of justice, their own, like they are still getting to be the arbiters of, punishment, which is interesting, I think, especially one thing I picked up more on this time is like Ken's history, where we find out that he had a wife, his wife was killed, and then it's alluded to at least, or mentioned that like he killed the person who killed his wife. So like
I think Harry did, right? I think that's why he's indebted to
yes, that's why he's indebted to Harry. So there's this idea too that like Ken has seen justice within this system himself, of like, I have received for myself kind of this quote unquote justice through this outlaw system or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he is leaning on the side of grace by wanting to like help Ray go free, but he's still operating within that world of like trying to be the arbiter of justice himself outside of the family or the law or society as a whole. In a sense, like Ray, in giving himself up to other people, is escaping like both of those options.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess it comes down to in both of those perspectives, like with Ken and Harry, they are both trying to be their own judge or give themselves like
Yes, yeah.
absolution or find some way. And I think that's a tendency that a lot of people have when they are caught doing something bad or trying to like ease their own conscience. Like they'll try to make up their own justifications or their own like path for redemption. And it's especially hard to like really give yourself up at the mercy of someone else. Like I don't think there's a lot of people who would be inclined to do something like that when they have transgressed in some way or another or committed a crime or at least done something that they themselves feel guilty of and that they want some absolution from. That's an interesting aspect too that I hadn't really thought about before, but yeah.
I thought of it as we've been talking about it and kind of as I was watching it this time. It's not a fully formed, there might be some holes in the movie in that theory. It's not a fully formed idea, but that's my on the fly thesis of like the kind of moral situation in the film. I don't know. That's what I love about this movie is it's like, it's kind of a fun, well, not fun. I wouldn't describe this movie as fun necessarily. It's an outlandish, funny movie, but like it's also dealing with these like heavy issues in a complex and interesting way, which is great. I love that.
Yeah, I agree. I'm trying to think of if there's any other movies that deal with guilt and punishment in a way that In Bruges does.
I can't think of any off the top of my head.
Because yeah, going back to like the point you said about Ray being not this great character, like this whole movie from the beginning, it's almost like something that shouldn't work on paper because it's balancing so many different tones. It has the extremely dark comedy and then there's these extremely tragic themes. And then within Ray as well, like he's super funny. He's like this childlike character almost, but he's also like someone who's genuinely did something bad. And then there's other moments where he kind of like, he's reminded of that. And then he breaks into like this super serious character who also wants to communicate about, like there's this beautiful scene where he and Ken are talking about, like he's trying to, at first he's talking about like, oh, what do you think about like hell and heaven and all that sort of stuff. And then Ken goes on this kind of tangent and he's like, you can see like Ray growing frustrated. Like I'm trying to like talk to you about something here. And then Ken, of course, he's like, oh yeah. And it's balancing so many of these different emotions, and it's a weird movie too. Like, I wonder how he like the director like sold it because it's like how
do you
I still
this?
find it like difficult to describe in terms of like if I'm trying to manage like expectations of someone. Like it's funny, but it's also kind of sad, and it's a fun watch, but it's also like really deep and like there's lots of stuff going on.
You talking about that scene where they're having that conversation about hell reminded me of that moment right after Ray is trying to kill himself and then Ken comes up and stops him. You know, they're both like, what are you doing? And Ray's like, you were going to kill me. And Ken is like, well, you were going to kill yourself. So like, what's the big deal? And Ray is like, yeah, but I'm allowed to kill myself. You're not. And Ken's like, no, you're not allowed to kill yourself, which also it kind of feeds into that point of like, whose hand is justice allowed to rest in? Like, you know, in that instance, Ken's kind of saying like, you're not allowed to take justice into your own hands. It's up to me to either dish it out or let you go free. But then, you know, he kind of turns on that towards the end. Ken's jumping off the tower at the end is kind of an odd point because like, in some sense, he's choosing to end his own life, but he's also trying to do it as like an act to save Ray. Yeah, it's more of a, even though the gun is completely mangled by the time he gets it. that part always gets me. He so dutifully tucks it into his coat so it doesn't get destroyed when he falls, and then it's just wires and
yeah, there's a lot of those moments where the movie takes these strange like unexpected turns, or like almost because of like trivialities. The whole scene with Ray escaping, he's put on the train and then he's set to escape somewhere, and it's like almost like done, and then he gets recognized by this cop from this guy who he had a fight with back in a bar, which was like this completely, at the time it felt like this completely unrelated moment. But yeah, that's again, it's one of those examples where stuff like from earlier comes back to. It's a great film to watch with like an eye for detail, because it's very rewarding in that sense. It's the same thing with when Harry, he's like picking up the gun to go kill Ken. Like he denies like the Uzi because he's not like some gangster from LA, but he does take like these, I'm not sure what they call them, but this sort of head exploding bullets, which obviously come back in the end as they pass through Ray. But then with the dwarf, his head is blown up because of it. And so that's why he also doesn't recognize him as an adult, but he only sees like the child's body, so to say. And there's another one that I thought of, that you have the scene early on where Ken is trying to visit the tower, but he only has like 4.90 of the €5 that he needs, and because he's trying to get rid of his change, and the cashier won't allow it, so he has to take back the coins and break a 50. But then at the end, when he's up at the tower, that's why he still has like the coins, and he can like throw them as the warning sign so that he doesn't land on someone.
And then that same guard can't be bribed with $100 bill because like we've already established that he's by the books, by the rules kind of guy. It's very well written in that regard. I think I appreciated this movie more after I watched Martin McDonagh's most recent film, because I watched In Bruges first and then saw Three Billboards, and then I've seen In Bruges twice since then, I think. Three Billboards is a very different kind of movie. I mean, it also has some kind of like darkly comedic elements, but it's a more serious drama and is well written. But like it was seeing like, oh, there's, this is not just a off-kilter hitman comedy. Like there's something else going on underneath In Bruges than just like a funny dark comedy.
Have you seen Seven Psychopaths as well?
I haven't seen that yet. No, I want to see that one. Is that one good?
Yeah, it's not as tight, I would say, as In Bruges. It also has Colin Farrell in another great performance, and also the guy who's also in Three Billboards and Moon.
Sam Rockwell?
Yeah, he's also in Seven Psychopaths in a fantastic role. The Seven Psychopaths also really has this kind of meta layer that's also in Bruges, but it's more explicit in Seven Psychopaths, where there's like the main character is trying to write this story, and then we obviously see the story unfold, and then it also kind of starts to unfold like in the story of the world itself. And there's kind of In Bruges also has these meta layers where, and you mentioned like there's a movie that's going on, like there's filming a movie in the movie, and towards the end, it becomes like, it adds like this level of theatricality. And there's this funny moment also right before Harry and Ray have their confrontation in the hotel. And the hotel owner is like, can you just not just put down the guns and go home? And they're like, no, this is a shootout. By the logic of like the third act finale, this has to happen now. I won't spoil Seven Psychopaths, but that film has a similar moment where it kind of like sets up an expectation for any third act and then kind of subverts it in a really interesting way while also kind of having its cake and eating it too. But yeah, that might be an interesting film to also talk about at some point. But yeah, for now, it's just in Bruges, that was just this, it was more like these little moments sprinkled in between.
There's a joke in there towards the beginning that I really like when Ken first meets Jimmy at the bar and he asks him what kind of movie they're filming. And I forget what exactly he says, but Jimmy says something about indie, Eurotrash, something or other. And and Ken is just like, oh, like in a bad way. It's just, I appreciate those filmmaker jokes. I've had Seven Psychopaths on my list for a while. I haven't gotten around to it, so maybe I'll have to bump that one up on the list.
So for last question, maybe, like, what do you think about the ending? Do you think Ray survives, or what are we supposed to feel there?
I feel like he's made it out of purgatory. So like kind of whether or not he survives, he's progressed to whatever's next, like back into life, whether that's in the real world or like beyond this one. Maybe not literally, but just like within the function of the story, it's kind of like, I don't know. I mean, I think it's left ambiguous on purpose. So I guess I don't have a strong feeling as to there being one specific answers.
Yeah. I think it's one of those films where from whatever angle you look at it, like thematically or symbolically or like plot technically, it's everything is resolved. Like,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't need to have like a stronger ending. Like even if you interpret it as like metaphorically, like he's dying, but he's metaphorically going to heaven, like that's the same ending as you would get when you would say like he survives and goes to accept his punishment and then maybe finds the same kind of redemption or at least absolution. Yeah, so I think I read that in the original script there was a scene written behind it, or that was supposed to come after the actual ending, in which it was implied or at least more strongly suggested or even like maybe explicitly stated that Ray would survive, but it doesn't really matter like how you interpret it in the literal sense, that is.
The key is like when he's like in voiceover kind of saying the thing he's saying at the end of like, I'll accept my punishment. I like believe him as a character. Like I believe his character at that point. And I think like that's what matters ultimately, is that he's kind of been able to, in some sense, like not escape the guilt, but at least like come to terms with it by accepting punishment and giving up like control of his life. You know, he's no longer trying to just like punish himself. Yeah, like I think that's the key. So what happens to him after that isn't that important to me personally.
Yeah, it's kind of like the ending to Inception, where a lot of people speculate about like, what does it mean exactly? Like, is he dreaming? Is he not dreaming? Was it all a dream all along? But like every interpretation would have the same, just a different expression of the same ending, basically, which I think it's fascinating when you can do that with a movie.
Yeah. I don't want him to die, but if he did die, it would kind of be like he's at least reached some kind of peace like prior to dying. If he lives on, I'd be a little bit worried that like a month would pass and then he'd like even though I do believe him as he's saying that, he is such a childish character that like I'd be a little worried he'd like get into some kind of circumstance and like go back on his word or like fall back into trying to escape guilt or something. I would worry for him a little bit if he survives, I think.
Yeah, but I don't think he's gonna come out like a perfect saint.
No, he's probably still got some issues he needs to deal with.
But I wonder to what extent there's an intentionality there because you do see him like when he's in the restaurant and there's this guy next to him that makes the Canadian that makes this kind of sassy remark that he's like, am I gonna let this go? I'm not going to be able to, like, he seeks out the confrontation anyways. It is suggested that it is a little bit in his nature that he's this natural troublemaker to some extent, and he will probably find himself in trouble again if he were to survive this movie. But I guess what that says is also that, like, you maybe redemption doesn't have to mean, like, becoming a perfect saint afterwards. Like, it's also, you can still be a flawed person and be deserving of, like, redemption or, like, at least absolution or There's one final thing that I was thinking about, and that's when you talk about like the idea of needing absolution, and specifically like in the form of like giving yourself up to someone else or at least some other force other than your own. Like, to what extent do you think that human beings in general depend on like having some external force that judges them or like guides them or punishes them or absolves them for that matter?
I definitely think it's a trap to be stuck entirely within your own like sense of self-justification, or, you know, especially in instances where you've maybe wronged someone else. It's like in order to escape the guilt of having wronged someone else, like I think you do kind of need to give yourself over to something else, you know, even if that's the law in the sense of like society's agreed upon like punishment for the thing. Like I think you're going to be unable to escape that if you are just trying to absolve yourself within yourself, because it's like you've kind of gone in doing the harm that you've done to another person, you've kind of gone beyond yourself. So like if you punish yourself for that, it doesn't, in a sense, like I don't know if it really counts, because like the person who's been wronged doesn't know that. I don't know. It's all very complicated, but like, yeah, I definitely think there's something to that psychology of like, if you've wronged somebody else, and then you just decide like, oh, I've made it good, that doesn't really resolve the situation. Like, that's internal to you. And to have some kind of real absolution, you need something outside yourself, hopefully involving like the person who was wronged, or like, you know, a third party mediator or something.
Yeah, I think the issue, of course, with going directly to the person you have wronged is that they might be like overly emotional too.
Yes,
and
yeah.
then it might turn into like this revenge fantasy deal. But yeah, I was thinking about the novel Crime and Punishment that I mentioned by Dostoevsky, because the character in that story also, he doesn't get like a clear or as clear of a redemption at the end as Ray does in Bruges. Like, he ultimately confesses his crime. He's sent to this like Siberian work camp, but he doesn't, like, he feel like his soul isn't like completely restored, like even if he has like accepted the punishment of like the manslaw. But
he kind of gives himself over to God at the end, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, there's a more religious aspect, I think, to that redemption. But yeah, it's been a while since I've read it, so I don't have it that fresh in my mind. I think either way, it's like this, it's more presented as this work in progress. Like, you have to continue to work actively on this, like on the road towards restoration and redemption. It's not something that you achieve and then you have it and then you're done. It's like this continuous path, which is an idea that I kind of like, although it might not be as hopeful for those who are actually dealing with guilt. But yeah, there is some like road or path to be taken. There's a way towards redemption, I think, and just gotta work hard towards it, I guess.
Yeah. I think some people think about like redemption and they think like, oh, redemption is like restoring everything to the place that it's been. And I'm like, I don't know that it's necessarily that, like, because you can't go back and undo the wrong. So like, sometimes people have an overly high standard for, I think, what redemption looks like. But like, part of redemption is that accepting of what you've done. Like, you know, if you have this idea of like, oh, I've done this wrong thing and now I can be redeemed, and that means I'll never feel bad about it again. Society will totally accept me and it'll be as if I never did it. It's like, that's not really an attainable reality, like in a non-spiritual sense, I think. And I think that's part of the reason why like redemption is often seen in spiritual terms, is because like, you know, in a sense, completely wiping the slate clean, like, is kind of an impractical reality on like a functional level, like, you know, because it doesn't work that way in real life. I think there is kind of like a personal redemption. Hopefully, I don't know. I haven't experienced this, so I don't really know. I haven't been into like deep guilt and then experienced redemption from that. Although I think we've all to some extent dealt with situations where like we feel like we've wronged somebody or we did something, and then, you know, experience what it's like to have the other person like tell you like, no, that's okay. But I think like such a important part of that process is like letting go of that control of your moral standing, like, and that almost allows you to like feel redemption in yourself, regardless of then, like, you might be in prison for the rest of your life. It's like, but feel redeemed, like you've been given a second chance because you've faced up to the consequences for whatever wrong has been done. It's a complicated process, idea, psychology maybe, that I think like we don't really have a lot of words for in modern society outside of like religious frameworks. That's where a lot of these ideas have been traditionally dealt with. And then, you know, in our modern society, we haven't replaced those things except in very legal terms usually. But that doesn't deal with people's like internal kind of.
It's not the spiritual / personal / cultural aspect of it.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, like, you see that same lack of language in a lot of movies, I think, where redemption is often portrayed as this one act of redemption, basically, this, usually like this one-off like sacrifice, or like some bad character has this change of heart at the end of the movie and then sacrifices him or herself, and then all is good. Like there's this whole movie it was this comedy, I'm forgetting the name. It was this kind of apocalyptic movie with like James Franco, Seth Rogen, and a whole bunch of those comedic actors. And then they all tried to go into heaven, and then it turned out like, oh, the best way to go into heaven is to make a kind of like sacrifice. And so, but it also showed this really like simplistic idea of like, okay, do this one act to put the odds back into your favor and then ascend upwards.
Yeah.
But it's always difficult when movies, they try to convey something that takes like these complicated emotions like grief or guilt, something that people usually struggle with for a prolonged amount of time that they never truly resolve. And then in movies, we tell stories in ways that are compressed and that have like these nice like resolutions. And there's a lot of things in life that obviously do not directly offer that, which makes those more difficult to talk about. But that's also why I do really admire the movies that do. And yeah, I think In Bruges is definitely one of those movies that, at least when it comes to guilt and communicating the burden and like communicating the weight and really emphasizing the roads towards resolution, like the ways that will probably won't work, the ways that might. Yeah, I think that's what made it worth watching for me.
Yeah, I like that compression that you mentioned. It's often, unfortunately, I think finds itself in like violent justice in films, because like, especially if you think about like serialized murder mysteries or just murder mysteries in general, like the amount of times the story is kind of resolved by like, oh, the killer gets shot or, dies. It's like, because like them going to court and then going to prison and like all of that has to happen like after the movie or be this big long, it's like, that's not fun to watch. That's inconvenient. That's messy. So we want something like concise that's like, oh yes, justice was served. They got what was coming for them and now the movie can end. And it's like, as you said, that's not really the way that life works most of the time. And I think there's kind of an empty justice in that often, where it's like, it's just an eye for an eye type of retribution instead of like a true like redemption or justice or something like that. So I appreciate that In Bruges comes to that point of like, you have this feeling of redemption, but it's also extending that beyond the film and implying that some larger sort of change has to take place for Ray in order for that like redemption to be real.
I agree.
Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula, where you can listen to all of our episodes a week early without any ads, and you get to hear exclusive bonus episodes. Our first one on Sam Mendes's 1917 is out right now. The best way that you can get Nebula if you don't have it is by signing up for CuriosityStream, which comes with a free Nebula subscription. You can go to curiositystream.com/cinema of meaning or click the link in the show notes to sign up today, and we'll see you again next time.